So I am here to give you an update on the Transportation Subcommittee's review of the Alta review for the various options for the 3rd Street corridor, and an update on some other things that are happening with the corridor at this time. At the June 4th meeting, the City Council received the briefing on the Alta's opinions for various options for the 3rd Street corridor based on the Transportation Subcommittee's work looking at corridor options, in particular Plan C. The council directed at that time that those options be presented to the Transportation Subcommittee for their review and to get some input back. And then those two options that were identified by Alta that the Transportation Subcommittee took a look at were option 1 with a western terminus of the two-way separated bike lanes at the intersection of Washington and 2nd Street versus option 2, the western terminus of the two-way separated bike lanes at the intersection of Jefferson and 3rd Street, or some combination thereof. If there was any mix and match of the variables that the Transportation Subcommittee felt would be appropriate, you were interested in those as well. So the subcommittee met last Thursday on June 14th, and their conclusion was that option 1 should be pursued by the city. That includes the two-way separated bike lanes at Washington and 2nd Street. In that, knowing full well that we would have to take quite a few steps and work with the Idaho Transportation Department to work out the details of how that project might proceed. So the other details of option 1 that the subcommittee reviewed and proposed were, again, revisions to the Washington and 3rd Street intersection that would go along with that. A center median at Jefferson Street, transit stop modifications at Adams Street, that would be the transit buses staying within the lane rather than pulling out of the lane, and then the reconfiguration of the Mountain View Road and 3rd Street intersection, and that's surrounded around that hawk signal at the crossing of Mountain View Road there, which, as a side note, works particularly well with that child pedestrian safety grant that we have in place, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. So we have several projects in regards to the 3rd Street corridor. First that I'll hit on, with these various components, we also have the child pedestrian safety grant in place, and then the Alta report revisions, and I'll hit on a few of those as they've been laid out by Les McDonald in the memo that you all have, and we have extra copies up front as well. So 3rd Street reconstruction phase 2, this is a portion of 3rd Street including new underground utilities, road base and paving. The curb bulbs that were also included in the Transportation Subcommittee's recommendations would also be included in that project, which was made it through design and was awarded and currently beginning construction. Specifically, those curb bulbs would be appropriate for the CPS, or the Child Pedestrian Safety Grant project, so that worked out well. That section of the roadway did not include any adjustments or review by the Transportation Subcommittee under the Alta recommendations, so that works moving forward. Then there is the second phase of the corridor improvements, and this is, the first phase would be from Adams Street to Mountain View Road. That was also a section that did not require further review of the Alta recommendations. They were not impacted by those recommendations. Design is nearing completion, and our engineering department anticipates going out to bid by the end of June for that piece. And again, no changes to the design in that area based on the subcommittee's review, because that was out of the scope of the Alta review. So. The second phase of that would be the remainder of the corridor with the exception of the Adams Street intersection, which I'll touch on in a moment. Pending direction from the City Council, that's where that option 1 that the Transportation Subcommittee is recommending would come into effect. That first step would be for staff to get in touch with the Idaho Transportation Department, pending Council's approval, to look forward to how we could pull that project together with them. Also anticipating that could take several months, and so delay of design of the project would be probably several months. We'd be looking at more of a 2019 for sending that out to bid and actual construction, so just keeping that in mind. And then back to that Adams Street intersection. That piece in particular is the intersection in front of the high school here, and if we maintain that within the current phase that's in design, would put the timing of closing that intersection for construction right about when school starts, knowing that would not be a good viable option. Got a couple of possibilities that we could address that with, and specifically that's a change order to the current 3rd Street reconstruction project that's ongoing right now. Or the second alternative is to look at a new contract. It's separated as a smaller project. It's anticipated it would be under $50,000, which would allow us to do that. An approach that is just a separate project on its own with a contractor bid approach. Either way, we'd like to get that done by mid-August, and those two alternatives would allow us to do that. So we would not be closing that intersection when school starts up this fall. And then back again to that Mountain View and Third Street intersection, a corridor lighting component, and this does fit nicely with the Child Pedestrian Safety Grant again. Looking at that hawk signal, which the Transportation Subcommittee did recommend, and I believe Council was also seemed in favor of at the June 4th meeting. And go ahead and purchasing that hawk signal, if that works, because that fits well within that CPS grant, would allow us to get that project started, which is a requirement of that grant. And then we'd be able to move forward with installation of that with the various phases of the corridor. And then finally, Third Street project bid solicitation, just an update on that. Looking to schedule that to send out the bid solicitation that is around June 16th, that went out last Saturday, with a bid opening on July 3rd. So that portion of the project is moving forward as well.
You zoomed right through that, Jen, lickety-split.
I can channel my inner Les as best I can. I'm a little bit better at Gary's thoughts on this, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
A couple of things I want to point out to council on this is this Child Pedestrian Safety Grant that we've got for $250,000. This has to be started implementation this summer as we go along, because that was part of the grant. So some of these things, like the hawk sign you talked about, the Adams Street Rising, those are projects that we can get started, as well as sidewalks down 3rd Street, down from Roosevelt Street up would be west. So those projects could actually get started this summer without any infringement on what happens to Jefferson Street or Washington Street while we're waiting to get a decision from ITD, if I heard you correct.
Correct, thank you.
One other thing I wanted to mention, you talked about the 3rd Street Bridge project solicitation schedule that is out, as you correctly said. We also have an alternative bid in that, so we can see what a bid would be right away to have that happen, or a bid that would happen first thing in the spring of 2019. So there's two parts of that bid that we will be seeing as well. So, Arthur.
You mentioned the median island at Jefferson. What did the committee conclude about that one? Was it going to be pushed to the north or right down the middle, as Becker Gooch indicated that she preferred?
I believe it was as Alta recommended.
So pushed off to the north.
Thank you, yes. Okay. Yes.
Catherine, you were on the council liaison for the subcommittee.
Yep, and we met from 6 to 8:30, and 2 members are here too, and they are very valuable and gave great input for that. And everybody was there except for, I think, 1 member, so it went on really long, and everybody wanted to get it done that night, and we did. And consensus was everything that Alta had recommended with option 1, and there was really strong feelings, especially from certain members of the subcommittee, to really ask ITD to work with us on getting the bike routes. Would either of you want to say any more on that?
Well, hang on a second, Catherine. What we're going to do, we're gonna get those guys up here in a little bit, but I want to go ahead and let council talk a little bit to Jen first, but then I plan on getting some input from the folks out here as well. Brandy?
So let's see, so everything could be done up to Jefferson while we're approaching ITD. What would happen during that time gap if the two-way protected bike lane ends at Jefferson and we hope that ITD approves it? How do people enter and exit in the meantime?
We would have to plan for a transition to mitigate that
Okay.
until we could get that final leg or that final phase
So there would be
implemented.
something sort of temporary, maybe? or-
Either, I would of course leave this up to the engineers, but looking at something to either transition that or put that portion in last, some sort of phasing or something to approach that so it doesn't just stop right there.
Right, but the intent would be to go all the way to there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that would also depend on the conversations with ITT if we felt that it was a possibility. I think that's really the first step in any of this before we can move forward with that, dealing with that transition
Right.
spot there.
Okay.